Hello everybody, welcome back to this series that we've started with the Jung talks. I did the first version with Volker, who interrogated me a lot about all the things going on in this chart. And a lot of people were a bit confused about all that, so I decided to do this video again, but now simply showing the method and the implications that it has for the life of Jung. You can study this in your own time, and it's a bit shorter than the version that was put out before. I hope you will enjoy this, and I hope it will teach you something about the interesting methods of Hellenistic astrology as pertaining to the chart of Mr. Jung. So let's have a look. Now, before we delve into the life of Jung as per his chart, let me first say something about my involvement with Mr. Jung, which of course was when I started doing astrology in 1983. You could not avoid getting in touch with the Jungian astrology, at least in the Netherlands, because there was a famous astrologer here, Karen Hamaker-Zondag, who is Holland's most famous astrologer. I think she did many talks in the USA and all over the place, all over the world, I must say. So when I started studying astrology, this was the main psychological psychoanalytical astrology that was available at the time, and it was very interesting, and I was very enthused by it. So when I started doing astrology, this was all the rage. So after getting acquainted with astrology as such, of course I decided, because I wanted to become a professional astrologer, to delve deeper into the topic of the issue of psychology as such. And I started studying, reading up on psychology as a science, but then after that I was quite disappointed with it, simply because all the fantastic things you could see with a chart having to do with the depth of the human soul was not available in scientific psychological material. So my first guess was, well, what I've learned was actually psychoanalytical astrology, and it in a sense it is more about a sort of philosophy than perhaps the depth of the human soul. But of course that is a topic that much interests ancient philosophy as well. So that was interesting for me, because I didn't know much about psychology as such, but I was very intrigued by this fantastic instrument which helped us delve into the depth of the human soul. So yeah, I started studying Jung and his ideas and his teachings, and I read a lot about them, about him. In a previous video, the longer one, Volker said that when you read this stuff, you haven't read anything about him, because there are, I think, more than 5,000 books on the life of Jung and his work and his ideas, etc. So yeah, there's a lot to learn about it. And I even taught a class on Jungian philosophy, and Jungian psychoanalysis. So that was very interesting to do, and it gave me a deep insight into his work. But after that also there came some criticism on his methods. You must understand that both Freud and Jung are a bit scorned at in scientific psychology, simply because their ideas are now superfluous or are dejected as having anything to do with scientific approach of psychology. And there's also some what you could say some difficulty with some persons. So this is the story about Richard Noel, who wrote the Jung Cult, which is an interesting title simply because this is what is the criticism of Jung's work. It's sort of a cult, and only devotees are interested in it and work with it, and are a bit sort of fanatical, etc., etc. That's the standard skeptic view of anything having to do with something relating to occultism or the alternative sciences, as you could say, etc. There is a very good book on Jung and astrology, which is by Maggie Hyde, who was a very was very deep into Jung and very deep in astrology, and she left Jung's work. You can read it in his book. It's a nice read. And then she returned to him simply because a lot of stuff was missing, which had to do with the way he viewed astrology and other things. So that's a good read, and please avail yourself of this book if you can find it, because the interesting thing for me is, and it's also sort of a boost for traditional astrology, she criticizes the easy way in which modern astrology, modern psychological astrology, all things being equal, of course, because there are different people and different levels of professionality dealing with this, but she blames much of modern astrology as being too superficial for anything having to do with Jung and astrology. So, and she said that she was more enthused about the traditional way of getting your feet on the ground in a chart and then working with it. So that's interesting. There are two interesting books in which she wrote together with an illustrator, which are very interesting to read, simply because they're pretty good introductory material into Jung. So when you can find these booklets, avail yourself of them, because they are very interesting and they are very complete. Of course, they do not go very deep into all the ins and outs of all his theories and all his material, but it's a very good introduction. So avail yourself of it, and I used it also to try to get some information on Jung as a person. Remember, I have a lot of material on Jung, so I know quite a bit about his youth, etc. So let's have a look at the chart from Mr. Jung. So let's have a look at this chart of Mr. Jung. I must say that I introduced stuff that I treated of in previous videos, so please check out my YouTube channel and try to find the material on the talks I did for Acuta, the webinars I did there, which are relatively recent introductions into the work of Mr. Robert Schmidt, who is my main source for a lot of this material, and also the videos on zodiacal releasing from spirit, which I call aphesis. You can find these videos on my channel as well, and there you can find a lot of information about all the things I will be talking about, but I will also be introducing new things in this video, simply because a lot of stuff is not yet how you say put into practice, and I will try to do this with this chart, and you will see that there is a lot of new information to be found when you use these methods and you use these principles, again as expounded by Mr. Robert Schmidt in his excellent restoration of the Hermetic tradition, the Hellenistic astrology of ancient times, the source of all modern Western astrology. All the traditions in Western astrology have their basis in the astrology of the Hellenistic period. Perhaps I did a talk for a group here in Holland in which I showed what I showed was the difference between the previous astrological traditions, if they can so be called, the Mesopotamian traditions, the Babylonian traditions, and the Egyptian traditions, and these were the stuff that was in that material was used, but not to the extent that the Greek astrologers invented all sorts of principles. For instance, the Thema Mundi, a model of all the principles they introduced into astrology, and without the Greek astrology we would not be practicing astrology as we do today, because the most principal things can be found in the Hellenistic tradition, in the Greek astrology of early days, and you can hardly find them in the Babylonian, the Mesopotamian, or the Egyptian tradition. So perhaps I will show these videos. Let me just introduce them here. I will just show them to you. Okay, so in one of my previous videos I talked about this principle, the way that Mr. Schmidt worked the texts in the Greek ancient astrology, and these are very important things to take into account when we think about the work that he did, because it was very difficult. And I also said that his major work on definitions and foundations, which unfortunately is not yet available to the general public. That's very sad, because a lot of important things are written in that book, and you will hear me talking about it and quoting Mr. Schmidt on some of this material. But the important thing is that he used the Greek language as a tool to get into the heart of this astrology and what was meant by it. So this is the principal motivation for how we did that, and the reason why he did that, because nowadays, as the first sentence says, we have a legacy of Latin and Arabic astrological jargon with many layers of translations in between, and everybody who has ever tried to translate something, translating is treason, as somebody said, simply because you have to choose one specific meaning or several of them, all indicated by a simple word, and one word can mean has many nuances, and Schmidt was very good at ferreting them out. So okay, so this is the principle, and one of his primary statements was that the astrologers were in the enviable position to create and design, or rather conceive, the astrological technical language from scratch, and not having to rely on translations. And well, these texts are multivalent and cryptic, but he was pretty good at deciphering them. But the reason why he said that is very important. So let's have a look at why he did that. So as he said, they chose these words, this technical language, deliberately, and he also often said, well, they could have said it much more easily, or they could have expressed it in a much simpler sentence, etc., etc. So they did it on purpose. They used these words specifically for a specific reason, often to keep it sort of a secret, what was written, what was meant. So you, as a student, you had to delve into it, as Schmidt has done. So that's very important. So there's a very wonderful saying in Dutch, the heavens speak, but my question is, in which dialect does it speak? So okay, so these Greek astrologers were in the enviable position to create and design their own astrological technical language from scratch. They did not rely on translations. So let's have a look of, because how do you know that, Mr. Schmidt? Well, he studied, of course, many texts, so here is his prime reason for establishing this and defending this position. So Mr. Schmidt, in his basic course on Hellenistic astrology part 2, said the following about the texts as written by the Greek astrologers, that all factors present in Hellenistic astrology cannot be found in earlier traditions, more specifically the Babylonian and Egyptian ones, which comprise actually most of the factors used in Hellenistic astrology. So let me give you the list Mr. Schmidt gave about what is missing in these earlier traditions. The first thing is the association of the horizon, and more specifically the ascendant with the 12 places. That's pretty interesting. You can find no astrological classifications that explain delineation principles, so there is no concept of sect in these ancient traditions, no sect-related rejoicing conditions, no qualification of planets as being benefics or malefics, no groups of images, signs, no gender, no elements, no good or bad places, no house trios and angular triads. Well, that is pretty devastating, right? And he continues, So things not found in the Babylonian, Mesopotamian and Egyptian astrological traditions. No way to link planets together, so no aspect and configuration definitions, and no lots are to be found in these traditions. No rulership concepts that link planets to images, signs, no domiciles, no exaltations, no triplicities, and no concepts that link planets to parts of images, so separate portions, degrees, decans, and domains, which we now call terms, which is a silly term for terms. So no concept about the joys of the planets in houses, no thema mundi that explains a lot of these definitions and these principles. And in the absence of all that, there were no astrological explanations available or to be generated about the life of the native in its totality, nor about individual topics in that life. And furthermore, there were no chronocraters to time events. So he concludes quite bluntly, I think. In short, before the Greek period, and he specifically mentions Eudoxus of Cnidus there was no astrology, and there was no astrology in the way we use it now, because all of these concepts are still to be found in the traditional astrological traditions, and they are very often also erased from modern notions on how to delineate charts. So, yeah, I think Mr. Schmidt is right. Greek Hellenistic astrology really is the basis of a lot of the Western traditions that generated astrology in the several periods in history. So, okay, let's, without further ado, go to the chart of Mr. Jung. So, looking at this chart, of course we have to do several things. First, we try to establish whether or not this is the right chart of Mr. Jung, and Karen Hamaker-Zondag mentioned to me that his daughter, who was an astrologer, said that Jung always used this specific horoscope, which can be a bit different than other ones you can find on the internet or even in official sources. But I will be using this one to get into the heart of this analysis. So, okay, so what do we do first? Well, before you start saying anything about a chart, you need to investigate the principles that support the strength of a planet and the quality of a planet, and that's what I do first before starting anything, before I can say anything about anything in a chart. So please make yourself a habitual user of these things, so you can try to establish what is shown or indicated by a certain planet. So, okay, so first thing to do is we try to establish impact. And a lot of people of you know this, we do that by strength. Which planet dominate this life by means of strength, and that has to do with planets being in pivots. And pivots are called the angular houses in modern astrology. And my funny question always is, where can you find an angle in a round chart? You cannot. There are no angles there, or there are no corners angles. Angular houses, so that's a nice joke. It works better in Dutch, perhaps. And of course, whenever a planet is with the MC or the IC, it gains in strength as well. It can have a lot of impact. So, okay, now in this chart you can see that Mr. Jung is blessed with quite strong planets in very important places, because they are in the first place, which is Saturn, the first topical place. The Sun we find in the 7th place, also a pivotal place, and the Moon found in the 4th image, which is also a topical place and also a central place, a stake as it's also called in the translations that are now going around in the medieval stuff. So these are the planets at the stake. They are in central images. Because the zodiac turns in these images, as I said in the other videos. It's very important to understand that these planets can be sort of a center in the life for a person, so things revolve around these planets, and they revolve around this person in the sense that these topics are central. The planets that are in these images are central for the specific topics as indicated by the places where they are. So Saturn is a very central principle for the personality of Mr. Jung. The Sun is a very central principle around which everything revolves which is the essence of what's called a center. And it's indicated by the sun, and in the fourth place everything that centers around the fourth place having to do with youth, etc., and the depth of perhaps the psyche has to do with the moon. So that's very interesting to note. That's the principle of central images, which are the what we now call the angular places. But again, where's an angle in a round chart, right? Okay, well, the second thing we need to do is establishing the quality, because you can have a very strong planet simply by its location in one of these places, topical places, but the question also is whether or not this will be good for the native, and that strongly depends on the quality of each planet. So we can have a look at this. We do this, we try to establish this by means of several indicators, but the most important one is whether or not a planet has any essential dignity, which means that it has a certain strength in relation, I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong word, it has a certain principle having to do with the domicile where it is. So many people call this strength. I refrain from using the word strength because I need to separate it from the notion of a planet being angular or in the succeedent signs, which has to do with the force of planets, their strength, and this has to do with their quality, which is quite different. So the quality of planets is much improved whenever they are in their own images, or exaltation images, or sometimes even smaller dignities, but I will get back in that topic in the next talk on Mr. Yoon. Okay, so we look at the second one, that's the sun, again in its own domicile, and we see the moon in its own exaltation. Wow, that's pretty good. These are really pretty strong planets, and also of very good quality. So all these planets are pivotal, they are strong by being pivotal, but they are also very capable because they are working using their own material, as it were, because they are playing at home, and playing at home is better than playing not at home, right? So let's say the principle of planets being in good quality, when you formulate it a bit psychologically, as I tend to do sometimes, is that these planets know what they are, who they are, and what they have to do in this chart, which is quite a different view from whenever planets are in debilities in a certain way, in their anti-dignities, etc. Then these planets are not very capable of establishing their own principles, simply because they are not in a place where they are happy, or where they have the means to be themselves, to use modern parlance. These planets cannot come into their own. They can, but they have to work hard for it. So you could, my principal view is that planets that have dignity are sort of simple talents that you can have, and that you need to develop them, but they are established. It's not something somebody needs to tell you about. My principal example is always Venus, having to do with relations. Whenever Venus is in its own domicile, or in its own how do you call them, dignities, then Venus knows what love is and what it's meant to be, etc., and how to deal with stuff having to do with love, etc., and relationships. And whenever Venus is not in dignity but in anti-dignity, then you have a person who is very insecure, or can be quite insecure about what is love actually. Well, what is this stuff? What is this all about? How do I am I doing it right in relationships, etc., etc. So you can say there's a certain amount of insecurity about how this planet functions and what it has to do in this chart. So that's a bit of a general sort of psychoanalytical explanation for me, how I use the dignities and the anti-dignities, the debilities. Now, one thing is very important for traditional astrologers. In modern astrology, the complete chart is seen as a model of the psyche of a person, which is not the case with traditional astrology. The psyche of a person is simply one of the topics available for evaluation in a traditional chart. So you could say that yes, Saturn, Kronos, is a planet that has a lot to do with Mr. Jung as a personality. And of course the other ones will come into play, but not necessarily as a description of things in his personality. They are simply descriptions of topics in his life. And they can be quite distant from a person, but they can also be very personal, can also be very intimate with a person. And there is a lot of material that can help us establish which ones are intimate and which ones are more at a distance. And I will try to do that with what I'm presenting here now. Okay. Okay, one step that you really must take also, and try to get into your work scheme, try to establish the support of the chart for the native, and this has to do with things that can help a person be successful in his life. And this is first shown by the triplicity rulers, which I'm showing here now. Mr. Jung is a day chart. His sun is still above the horizon, even though it's setting in the part where the sun goes underground, so to speak, which is of course a very interesting principle of somebody trying to get to the heart and trying to get to the depths of something that is going under, which is of course the unconsciousness. But that's interesting. Okay, yeah, so the triplicity rulers, well, let's try to establish him. He's a day birth, so we use the sect light, which is in this case the sun, and as Valens taught us and many other Hellenistic astrologers, you look at the triplicity rulers. And this is also a bit a difference with later traditions. It is pretty clear to Mr. Schmidt that this was really used only for dividing the life in two periods, the first period of life and the second period of life, and the third triplicity ruler was indicated to try to support the first and the second triplicity ruler. So that's an interesting take. I think I will do in the near future a talk on the the prenatal analysis, what Schmidt called the three grand approaches. And the first approach has to do with life in general. So you try with the first grand approach, you try to say something about the life in very broad strokes, not into details, but into broad strokes. And these are very interesting. And one of them is these triplicity rulers. You divide the life in two periods. And that's a very general statement about the life, right? So that's very important to understand. That's quite a difference with later traditions dividing the life into three periods. Because Schmidt said, well, the third period is always designated as being the cooperating triplicity ruler. So if it was really a factor having to do with dividing a third period of life, why would it be called cooperating, right? So yeah, this is about dividing life into two periods. But that's not how I'm gonna use it here. I will show it to you, but these are the triplicity rulers, and again we must say these triplicity rulers are pretty strong, simply because they belong to the sect in favor. Because you can also have triplicity rulers not belonging to the sect in favor, and that is a sort of a disqualification of some of the impact that these planets as triplicity rulers can have. So that's important to take into account. But the important thing here is that this is a strong, very strong support. Simply you can say that the second one, dividing the life in two periods, the second period, the general signification of a triplicity ruler being in the second, in a cadent house, actually would indicate that this is a lesser period in the person's life. It's not as good as the first one, because the first one is in an angular place and the second one is not. It's in a cadent place. But a great difference here is that Jupiter is of course a benefic planet, and it is trining the third period ruler. So the third period ruler is very strong this third triplicity ruler is in a very strong support of Jupiter, the second one, and also the first one, because they are all configured with each other. Okay, so that's enough about that. The other one is eminence, and of course we can say that Mr. Jung is an eminent figure. Everyone, I think a lot of people who hear the word or the name Jung will know who this is about, and that's an indication of the strength of eminence, right? When you are even remembered long after you're gone. So interesting. Another thing to never forget to do is to check out fortune houses, which are the houses counted from the lot of fortune. And here we find a lot of fortune in the Scorpion, and we count from this place around the zodiac again, and we give each image a new number as being the house relative to fortune. So, and what's very important is whenever you find planets being angular relative to fortune. So here we have these. Of course, Scorpion itself is the fortune ascendant, and then you see the fortune fourth, fortune seventh, and the MC, and you can see that all the planets that we ticked off as being very important in the life of Jung also are planets being in fortune angles. So that's a big plus. And what's also very important is that the angular places of the natal chart, so the first house, the first place, the 10th place, 7th place, and 4th place, are also angular places relative to fortune. So that gives a really big impact. So whenever these images are somehow fortified or somehow actual by being period rulers of a time, like with zodiacal releasing or imperfections, they give a big punch to someone's life. Perhaps not the career, but yes, the life is pretty certain. Yeah. Okay. It's interesting to me that the first place of Jung's life is also the fortune fourth place, and the most of the significations given to these places, the fortune houses, are also much in accord with what we normally understand as being the significations of the natal places. So the fourth place, one of them, is the mysteries, and we can really say that Mr. Jung was deep into the mysteries of a lot of things. Okay. I got this from zodiacal releasing, which is specific for that method, zodiacal releasing from spirit, but these principles can also account for somebody's success whenever you find these planets in these conditions relative to the fortune houses, and especially fortune MC and fortune first place. Then you can have a person who's really very fortunate in life in general. So whenever it's the sect light, which is here the case for the sun in the 7th place, which is the fortune MC, that is a big boost. So yeah, Mr. Jung is very famous. So these are the planets which get extra stars and extra kudos for being so strong in this chart. Okay, so let's now get into a delineation of the first place of Jung's chart, his personality, and his life in general. When we are talking about the first place, the first house, whatever you want to call it, traditionally, this is the place that has to do with the life of the person. It's the helm of life, which has to do with the principle that this is the oyax, the steering mechanism for the boat that is your life as a journey on a sea. And you steer the boat with your ascendant. That's how you act, how you do things. And it has to do with the body, because you're incarnated into it, and it has to do with breath, which is a very interesting word about the how do you call it, the spirit living within you. And Robert Zoller had a very interesting one-liner for that: vita corpus ingenium. Vita is the life force. Corpus is of course your body, and ingenium is the inborn spirit. So that's a very adequate one-liner for the topics of the first place. Now Of course, the characteristics of a person are also indicated by the image that is in the first place. And, and it's a solid image, which means that it's quite a stubborn person, and perhaps exacerbated by the fact that Saturn is also there. It's a solid image, so this is a solid person, but when we look at the delineation that Valence gives, it's not so flattering, because those so born are malicious and haters of their own families, they are unchangeable, they're single, etc., etc. That's really well, you would not say that to a person coming into your practice, right? This is not what you would say, but there's something else going on. So I'm not I think this has a lot to do with the idea of Saturn being a malefic planet, but yeah, okay, so this is what is given, and I'm not quite sure if this goes for this person. But what's interesting is that the short biography says that Jung was a bit of a strange melancholic child. Melancholy is of course something having to do with Saturn. But he was also quite lonely, in the sense that he didn't mind, I think, because Saturn is of course a planet that is antisocial in a certain sense. So Saturn doesn't mind being alone, and actually can be avoiding people as well. So that's an interesting statement. But he was alone simply by the facts of his life, simply because his brothers or sister were absent until he was 9. So he had 9 years of being an only child. So that's pretty interesting, because that has something to do with how the personality develops, right? And he played his own imaginary games, as we all do when we are young, right? So yeah, so that's interesting. But let's have another look at what's going on with this first place. And of course we have these significations belonging to the separate images in the chart. And the interesting thing is that these are accidental significations, because the belonging to the tropicals zodiac images, the solid images are the double-bodied images. That is not an accidental signification, but an essential signification of images. And these are these accidental significations, as listed here, all have to do with things specifically and typically for these images. So these are the things attributed to them. And sometimes this has to do with the stars that really draw this image in the heavens. So the fixed stars in them, called the flying vulture or the tail of the chicken, etc. These can also be used in traditional texts on the significations of the images, but I'm not quite familiar with them, in the sense that I do not use them very often. But I'm very interested in the fact that something Mr. Schmidt said. He said that the tropical zodiac, the one which we use, is actually the original, of which the images in the sky, the images, the signs of the zodiac, are actually the sidereal zodiac. I need to say more specifically, is the image. So we have an image and an original. The image is the sidereal zodiac, and the original is the tropical zodiac. And that's very interesting, but I will not go into that further. I need to think about that deeply. So having a look again at these qualifications, these are not very flattering, as I said, but they can be modified by configurations and aspects. And here we see, for instance, and we will be getting into that one, the Jupiter configuration with the water pourer, Aquarius as it's now called, and it has the testimony of the Sun being in the Lion. Well, that's pretty good support for changing these somewhat perhaps negative things in Jung's personality, as conceived in the Valence take on the water pourer. But there's something else that Mr. Valence says, and which I also explained in another video, another webinar, the second one in the which I did for Nightlight Astrology. Valence says that, for instance, for the Aries image, when the rulers of Aries are well situated and testified to by benefics, the natives become kingly, powerful, and have the power of life and death. So you can say you can do two things with images expressed as personality. You need to see whether or not the more base significations of this image is in play, or whether or not the more positive sides of each of the images is enhanced by a very good placement of the domicile master of this image. For the water power, that is of course Saturn, but that's an interesting difference. So whenever these rulers are well situated, and this goes for each image, then the better qualities of this image can be enhanced. And for instance, the power over life and death, which is of course a signification of both Aries, Mars, and the Sun, which is the exalted ruler of Aries, of the ram. And the interesting thing is that I often think that it almost seems that whenever these planets are well situated, it seems as if the significations of the exaltation lord are more enhanced in a certain sense. So the natives becoming kingly has nothing to do with Aries being the soldier, but it has to do with the sun, right? Having the power of life and death, that is something of course a soldier has as well, but also somebody who can decide whether or not somebody lives or dies. He has another example, which is the lion. The lion does not have an exaltation ruler, so this is about the sun. When it happens to be upon a pivot, or should be with benefics, they will become bright, esteemed, tyrannical, and kingly. Again, this is not about Jung, because the sun is not having a relation with something having to do with his personality and character. This planet, the sun in the 7th place, has to do with other people in his life, and that's a big difference. Of course, we judge every chart also by means of the ruler of the first place, the lord of the first place, which in this case is Saturn, of course, being in a solid image. So we can also ask, what other topics does Saturn bring into the mix? Because the life is somehow entwined with the principles having to do with the houses ruled by this lord of the first place, because they can have a strong impact on the development of the personality. So Saturn is of course the ruler of the 12th place in Jung's chart, which is quite interesting, because everything having to do with the darker side of life, the unconscious part of life. Please understand that the 12th house, the 6th place, and the 8th place are called the dark houses in the chart. So everything going on there is a bit invisible, and I think, what is the best definition of something being unconscious? You cannot see it. That's a very good definition of what is unconscious. So whatever somebody cannot see but is very strong invested in, you can see by, in this case, the combination of the ruler of the first place, Jung himself, being also the ruler of the 12th place. They are entwined, as it were. And also please note that Saturn is the exaltation ruler of the image of the scales, Libra, where we also find Jupiter, which I will address later in this talk. But yeah, Saturn also has a lot to do with the 9th place of religion, etc. And in another sense, Saturn is of course the planet having to do with stones and building and sculpting, and this is what Jung built, but with his own hands in Bollingen. I know he built the tower. I'm not quite sure if he built the rest, but yeah, he did it with his own hands. And he also sculpted, and he also did interesting things with stones. And a stone was something that was of major importance in his life, because he, as a child, being an only child, he often sat on a stone which he invested with some sort of magical power, a stone knowing things because it's so ancient that it went back into time very far. So, well, that's interesting. Saturn for you. So another very important topic in trying to get to grips with delineating somebody's personality or whatever in the chart has to do with Hellenistic teachings on planetary configurations. And let me first quote the sources that I used for this. Of course, Definitions and Foundations, the book by Robert Schmidt, and an intensive that I listened to and have studied in depth. It's the second intensive called Planetary Configuration, the Hellenistic Doctrine of Aspect and Testimony. So let's have a look at that, because it's pretty new, I think. I think a lot of people are not quite aware of the depth of all this material, and it's something to get acquainted with, because it's such a good instrument to differentiate between a lot of things having to do with configurations and planets having a relation with each other, of which there are three separate topics which I will show you. There are three different ways of approaching the relations between planets and other planets by three means, and I will show them which ones they are. So let's have a look at them. So here are the configurations with the planet that we are investigating here, which is Saturn, the ruler of the first place. And here we see the configurations that this planet has with other planets, or the other way around, however you want to put it. So you can see there's an opposition happening with the, via whole signs. Let's be certain about that. So the whole sign configurations. This is the exact terminology. Whenever you see planets in images having a relation with each other, you're talking about configurations. So, and there's a square or a tetragonal. The opposition is called diametrical, and Schmidt was very adamant about using these words for these configurations, and I will try to do it. But you will see these symbols that we use nowadays for these configurations. So there's a diametrical opposition with the Sun. There is a tetragonal relation with the Moon, which is a square. There are two aversions with Venus and Mercury. There's a hexagonal configuration with Mars, which is a sextile, and there's a trigonal relation with Jupiter. Now that's interesting. Well, the question that the ancient astrologers really asked very often is which one of these dominate, because you can have a lot of influences, you can have a lot of configurations, and not all of them are as important as perhaps stated by means of the idea that these are the configurations. So then we come to the definition of what an aspect is, and an aspect in Hellenistic terminology is all contacts between planets which are no further apart than 3 degrees, which can be 3 degrees applying and can be 3 degrees separating. So the totality of these portions is, and portions is the other word for what we now call a degree, which has also a strong base in the terminology that Schmidt has adopted for this this interesting topic of the Hellenistic astrology. So the totality is 6 portions. Whenever planets are in combination with each other within 6 portions, be it either, 3 portions applying and or 3 portions separating, then we are talking about an aspect. And the other ones are configurations. And the question is, what is the difference between them? So here we see that the actual aspect with Saturn, the ruler of Jung, we can say the representation of Jung himself in this chart, is both Jupiter and Mars. And the better one is Jupiter, because it belongs to the sect in favor, which is a very good one. And Mars is a more challenging one, simply because Mars is the planet not of the sect in favor. So this is a pretty severe malefic when he's activated. So let's have a look at that. But we need to establish what the difference is between planets having an aspect and planets having configurations. Now, one of the important things that Schmidt much emphasized was that the assumption of a figure, which is what an aspect actually is, how it's described in the ancient texts, the assumption of a figure having to do with a sort of stance in relation to the other planet. So the planet with each other, so they do it both ways, have a certain position, a certain stance towards each other, which can either be friendly or can be hostile. And a hostile configuration is, of course, whistling to somebody, or poking your tongue at them, flipping the bird. These are all simply things that planets do to each other at a distance. They are not yet engaged in a grapple, or engaged in a dance, or engaged in a fight, or whatever. So assuming a figure is something that is not within these range of three portions, but it's a stance of one planet towards another, and vice versa. That can either be hostile or friendly, but it's merely at a distance. So you can poke your tongue at somebody at a distance and then run away because the person reacts to it or not, but it's at a distance. So it's a stance, it's perhaps even an opinion of planet A about planet B, be it either a friendly one or a hostile one. Now the real aspect is engaging in a figure. So instead of simply having a stance towards something, now they are really at each other's throat, be it in a positive or in a negative sense. So the opening moves of a dance, now you grab your partner and now you start to dance together. The opening moves of a person wanting to fight you, as is in martial arts, now you're really engaging your opponent. So that's the difference between assuming a figure which is not within the reach of three portions, and the real aspect is engaging in a figure. And as I said earlier, engaging in a figure has to do with planets maltreating other planets, which is of course hostile, or bonify other planets, which can only be done when they are really interacting with each other. And this cannot be done by simply assuming a figure. When we come to the idea of testifying is perhaps something you noticed, but it could also be a position you take in regards to some other matter. And that's what these planets do when they are in the chart and assuming a figure. They have a stance toward each other, they have an opinion about each other, they express the opinion, which is not the same thing as really hitting someone over the head with it, right? Which is engaging in a figure. So that's pretty important. That's a very important distinction which must be taken into account whenever you delineate a chart, and especially delineating the ruler of the first place. So okay, so this is what's going on with Mr. Yoon. So these aspects, the ones from Jupiter and Mars, answer the questions which thing are or were a major influence on Jung's life. So that's pretty important, right? So what are these? Well, the 11th house is of course friends, breaches with friends, because we are talking about Aries Mars, which is a planet that is not always as friendly as we would like. Think about organizations. All the 11th place is psychological organizations of which he was a member and with which he broke, which is also something of Mars. And of course his row with Mr. Freud, which was also very important in his life. And the 9th house, of course, is philosophy, religion, academia and science. And these were very, very big principles going on in his life, as we can see here. Jupiter has this domineering positive influence, but also question, because it's Saturn receiving this aspect, and Saturn is a critical denying planet, and also one that asks questions about the validity of something, because Saturn wants to research it, right? So religion and everything having to do with divination and you name it, all 9th house topics were very great in influence on Jung's life, simply because he was the only son of a Swiss Reformed Church evangelical minister who also doubted his own belief in God. And Jung's family as such was steeped in religion. He had 8 uncles who were in the clergy, as well as his maternal grandfather. His earliest playgrounds were churches and graveyards. Well, graveyards, very Saturnine, right? All these pedestals and all these the graves where people rested, and everything built on them has to do with Saturn, right? The graveyard, death. Interesting. Now the next definition having to do with planetary configurations is the definition of testimony. And testimony is a very important principle of differentiating what planets are actually doing to each other and how they interact with each other. So, well, let's first quote Antiochus, his sixth definition, that the stars are said to exchange testimony, epimartoreo, with each other whenever they chance to be tetragonals or trigonals or diametricals or hexagonals of each other. So yeah, well, there you have it. These are of course the relations by means of whole signs. So this is the sign-based idea of configurations, right? So this has nothing to do with actual aspects. It's a different thing. So here we see two of them having moving towards Saturn. This is what they have, this configuration with Saturn. So diametrical by means of the Sun, and tetragonal, a square, by the Moon. So they are not within the range of the exact aspect of 3 degrees. So these planets have a testimonial relationship with Saturn, provided that they fall within the categories having to do with when it is actually a testimony or not. And let's have a look at that. So let's first have another look at some of these definitions. This is the one by Antiochus again. What he's actually saying here is that the relation needs to be fulfilled. So the applying aspects between these planets not yet within the reach of an aspect by 3 portions, it needs to fulfill 2 conditions, which they need to apply indeed, so they cannot be separating, and they need to perfect, as it's called in the ancient literature, before either one of them leaves the image that they are in at the moment. So that's important. And Schmidt said, of course, this concept of testimony is talked about hundreds of times by other astrologers without definition. So his work on these definitions is very important and crucial to understanding what it exactly means. So let's have another look. The idea of testimony was a very important one to understand the exact nature of what is meant by these astrologers by introducing all these several separate things about relations between planets. And please remember that one of the things that Schmidt discovered was the sort of judicial terminology, and whenever we are talking about testimony, that's of course something going on in a court, right? You ask a person about what did you see and can you testify to it about that, and being able to do so, one planet must see something else to be able to testify by means of it, to it or for it or against it, because the planet needs to have been a witness, right? And only a witness that's really saw something can testify to what he or she saw. So this testimony principle has a lot to do with aspects, in the sense which is the translation of looking at, and a lot of this aspect terminology, the configuration terminology, has to do with looking, being able to see each other. And you can also make a difference between simply glancing at something, which might be one of the interpretations of the word configuration, but you can also scrutinize, and scrutinizing is intensely looking at something. And you might say that a real aspect, the ones within 3 portions, are scrutinizing each other, or planet A is scrutinizing another one, which actually means that it's really looking very intensely to another planet. So that's an interesting difference as well. So it has to do with intensification, perhaps. So it's interesting. Now, this is what Schmidt said. Please read it in your own time. Providing testimony to each other, they assume a certain posture or attitude in relation to each other whenever we are talking about the testimony, and also simply talking about planets having a configuration but not being in aspect configuration. So postures or stances expressing different mental attitudes. I think this is really excellent terminology for trying to get to grips with what is this planet saying about another planet. It has an attitude toward this planet, so it's a friendly one or a hostile one, and I think you can understand what depth this brings to delineating the charts. So the word attitude, as Schmidt said, perfectly captures the dual sense of physical posture and mental state. Really, to me this was mind-blowing when I first came into contact with these sort of differentiations between configurations and aspect. It was really mind-blowing because it really lights up the chart, you know. So okay, let's have a look at. Okay, now getting back to the actual definitions of how we can establish whether or not a planet is testifying. It needs to have two scenarios going on, so it has to be when two planets need to be applying to each other, so there's an exception when they are not applying, then it's not a testimony, and whenever the two planets are converging toward the exact geometrical figure in the images where they are at the moment of birth, so the images where they are now. So so when we look at these planets, which are of course the moon and the sun, both lights are in contact with Saturn, and let's try to figure out whether or not this is testimony or not. And yes, they are testifying simply because they are both zodiacally moving toward Saturn, so these aspects, these configurations are still applying to each other, even though they are very far apart, but nonetheless this is testimony, and it happens before Saturn leaves the image where it's in, and it also goes for the planets, the sun and the moon, because they do not leave the image until after they have been in contact with Saturn. So yes, this is testimony. They testify to Saturn, and of course it goes both ways. Saturn himself testifies to the sun and to the moon as well. So yeah, when we take this into consideration and the provisos honored for testimony, I think we can see that there are some very interesting things to say and to differentiate between this specific terminology used for configuration and aspects. So this leads to the conclusion that there are several things to be said about the relation of a planet with other planets. So these are about all the relations that there can be between planets, and they are actually threefold. So these planetary interactions can be zodiacally, simply by disposition. So a planet has a domicile ruler, which is its host. Perhaps we can say something about the exaltation lord of the image, whenever there is one. And we certainly must talk about the bound ruler, which is a principle of forcible constraint, which I will address in the next video on Mr. Yoon. The second one of planetary interactions, of course, has to do with topical places, because there's also a house ruler, and there's also a specific relation, whenever there is one, of course, between the planet in a certain place and the ruler of that place, the house ruler, or the ruler of the place, the manager of the place. And now, as a third possibility, we have the configurations and or aspects, which are about assuming figures which is at a distance, or engaging in interactions which is in your face, so to speak, about bonification and maltreatment. And please look at these words used by Schmidt to translate what's going on with all these possible scenarios for planets having interaction by means of configurations or aspects. They are called testimony. There's of course application, but also separation, which is called flowing away, which is something else, or breaking off, which is also something else. There's talk of fellow traveling, there's talk of adherence, there's talk of neighboring, etc. So this really specifies something very important about the differentiation that is possible in addressing what type of relation does planet A have with planet B, and they are all by these three separate principles. So yeah, there's a lot of work for you as an astrologer to try to get to grips with each of them, but please try to do so, because they will really unravel and reveal to you all the principles going on with a certain planet. So I think this is good material, but it's a lot of study, and well, make the best of it. Now we need to talk, of course, about what does testimony mean, and Schmidt said that we still have to do a lot of research with the texts that he had available to him, and which he translated, but unfortunately he passed away before he could do that. So yeah, it's interesting to try to get to grips with the idea of testimony, and one of them is the one which I adopt here. We can also say this life is testimony of endurance, excellence, etc., etc. That's a sort of figure of speech. So there's a difference between the conceptualization of actual aspects, which are planets engaging with a person when we're talking about the ruler of the first place. These are planets, whenever they are within the 3-portion range, they actually interfere with the person in a good way or a bad way, because the nature of the configurations says something about what's happening. Is it maltreatment or is it bonification? And that's a big difference. So yeah, there's something to be said about the difference between the configuration and the testimony relation and the actual aspect relation, which is quite different. So yeah, another thing that's really important, application can go over sign boundaries, but configurations cannot. Because whenever a planet changes the image where it's in, then the configuration changes simply by means of the mediation of configurations by means of zodiacal images, which is very interesting. So, okay, that's enough about that. So when I try to use the image of this life is testimony of something, as is the case with Jung, because we're talking about the ruler of the first place, then we can say that Jung's life and personality is testimony of or testifies to the principle of what he called individuation, which of course is a very sun-like image, right? A sun-like principle to become an individual, which is of course something that the sun does. And this is defined as follows in the book that I showed here, the cover: the process of self-development in which an individual integrates the many facets of the psyche to become him or herself, an individual, a separate, indivisible unity with a sense of psychic wholeness. Well, there's no better definition of what the sun tries to do, right? So I need he did the studies of Mandalas, which is a path to the center, etc., which were very intriguing, and all had to do, of course, with the principle of the sun being a circle with the dot in the middle, which is, of course, the center of what the sun is about. Okay. Now the other one, the other testimony, comes from the moon, and also Jung's personality and his work in the greater sense testifies to the darker realm of the more occult and parapsychological experiences that he had and that accompanied his life and his work constantly. Again, remember there is a strong connection of Saturn, Kronos, with the 12th place as well, and it's trined very strongly by Jupiter being in the 9th place, and the 9th place is of course the place of divinations and seances and whatnot. So, and he wanted to treat them scientifically, because you need to understand that these contacts, these testimonies are not adverbial, they are hostile in the sense that the sun is making an opposition and the moon is a tetragonal square relation, so that's struggling with, it's trying to get to grips with it. So that's sort of a what you call a struggle, right? So and his work, of course, is also testimony of the archaic sciences that went before the advent of psychology, seances, alchemy, astrology, mandalas, shamanism, etc. All moon stuff. Please understand that has a lot to do with the moon as a general significator of the more, let's call it perhaps the subconscious level of life, and everything to do with the ninth place, but from a more experiential principle. Because when you look at Jupiter in the ninth place, that's more the official teaching of the church, right? Okay, another principle having to do with configurations and aspects has to do with the idea of superior position, and I've talked about this a lot, and I think a lot of you know this. It's whenever a planet is coming down upon another one, which is highly suggestive of something Jung did with other women, I think, but I'm sorry, pardon the pun. It's this, planets coming down on the ruler of the first place is of course Jupiter, which is in the ninth place, the 10th place or the 11th place. These are all planets named planets in superior position, of which the tetragonal, the square, is a very important one and perhaps the most dominant one, because whenever a planet is in the 10th place relative to the aspected planet, you can say that's in the MC of the other planet. So, okay, I talked about this and I'm not sure if I need to go into this further, because it actually enhances things that we already established of the influence of Jupiter and Mars in the life of Jung, right? So these are dominating, overpowering influences. They overpower the planet that they're coming down upon, which is Saturn, which is Jung's personality. Jung, his life in general, but also his personality, his way of dealing with it. So, and he has to deal with these planets, they are overpowering him. And Antiochus says that the star overcoming is more powerful if it is also a rising, which means heliacally rising, which is not the case here because the Sun is moving towards Jupiter and moving towards Mars, which means that they are heliacally setting. Not yet dramatically, I believe, but Jupiter is certainly becoming weaker, and Mars is also becoming weaker, but Jupiter more so because the Sun is more close to Jupiter. And whether or not they are pivotal, they are not, but yeah, so they're not that, in that sense, they are not as strong as they could have been when they are coming down on a planet from a pivotal place. They are very dominating. Now the interesting thing is that Saturn itself is also coming down on another planet, which is the Moon. So here we see something that has to do with the word called decimation, and decimation needs to be understood in a rather neutral way. It's diminishing the effect of the other planet, or tries to come to grips to it by dominating it. So there's a very strong influence of the Moon principles in Jung's life, simply because the Moon is quite strong and of very good nature, because she's in our exaltation image, and Saturn tries to deal with all that. So you could also say that Jung himself, Saturn, is trying to get to grips with the struggle with trying to understand what's happening with the Moon, what the Moon represents in his life. That's also a very interesting way of trying to describe that, right? Okay, so now I've treated all the aspects, all the configurations that were going on with Saturn, and now we need to turn to the non-aspects, which are the aversions. Aversions are always the planets that are in adjacent signs to a certain planet, which is in this case would be the 12th place or the 2nd place relative to Saturn, or the ones that are 6 or 8 places separate from that planet. So the planets in the 6th house, which is Venus and Mercury, are invisible, are in the 6th place relative to the 1st place, so they are in aversion. So Saturn cannot see them. They are blind spots to Jung, which is of course interesting because he did a lot of research into the animus principles, and they are mediated to him by other planets. So that's what we're trying to establish here. When a planet cannot see other planets, again, this is a configuration principle, aspect principle. Jung must rely on other planets which are able to see Venus and Mercury and apply and give testimony of these planets also to Saturn. So such an aversion can be mediated by testimony by planets that can see these planets and apply and testify to the planet that cannot see them. So in this case we need to find out which planets can see Venus, Mercury, and be able to apply to Saturn. So that's it. So let's check out this chart and see whether or not there are candidates that are able to provide Jung, Saturn, with information about what's going on with Venus and Mercury in the 6th place, the place that he cannot see all by himself. Now, first one is the Sun, but it is not a candidate simply because it's also in aversion to Venus and Mercury. It's a semi-sextile, as we call it now. Could it be Mars? No, Mars is of course applying to Saturn, but it cannot see these two planets simply because he's in aversion to them. So no, this is not a candidate. Is it Jupiter? Yes. We know that Jupiter is applying to Saturn. We established that before, but it can also see the image of the crab simply because he's in a tetragonal relation to it, which is a configuration described as being able to see something. So this Jupiter can see these planets, and he's in a position to inform Saturn about what's going on there. And there you have a very interesting principle of delineation, simply because it's by means of Jupiter stuff that Jung gets acquainted with the Venus Mercury stuff in his life, and also the Venus Mercury stuff relative to perhaps human history, as you can say, because as I said, I think that these two planets have to do with the animus and the animus, but people might debate that because Mercury described as the animus, the more rational male principle, well, some people may cast doubt on that, but I think it's a very adequate picture of what the animus can be and what it perhaps represents in our psyche. But that's interesting. But please understand that Jung wrestled with something going on in a religion which was not understood and had also a lot to do with repressed sexuality, etc., etc. So that's an interesting one. So yeah, Jung got a whiff of what was going on, this dark secret, through religion, and in religion perhaps. Okay, now as I said before, Jupiter has this domineering influence on Jung, something that fascinated him all his life from an early age on, and it carries sort of a secret, which is the invisible Venus-Mercury content. Okay, let's look at the other one. That's the Moon. The Moon, yeah, the Moon has also a hexagonal relation, a sextile relation with the planets in its own image, the crab. So yeah, the Moon carries something having to do with these two planets. But the question is, can she apply to Saturn? For that we need to have a look at this. This is a table of degrees where the planets are, and then we have to check, is the Moon able to come into contact with Saturn. And what we first see is that the Moon actually is transferring light, which is a horary question, a horary terminology. The Moon transfers light from Mercury to Venus. That's nice. So in a sense, Venus is picking up both Mercury and Venus and then carries it towards something, but not to Mars, because they are both in aversion. The Moon cannot aspect Mars. It can neither aspect Jupiter, because it's also in aversion to it, but yes, it can form a square with Saturn, the ruler of the first place, which is Jung himself. So yeah, the Moon is testifying to Jung about something going on in the 6th place, which is a sort of a secret to him. It's a dark place. Please remember that the 6th, the 8th and the 12th place, and also the 2nd place, were called the dark places of the chart, which means that you cannot see exactly what's going on there. And again, I quote my own definitions of what's of the unconscious, something you cannot see. And this is exactly what's going on in these places. Okay, so yeah, the Moon testifies to Jung about all this stuff. And here you have another table from Solar Fire, which neatly addresses the follow order of where the Moon is applying to. So again, Jung gets to know about Mercury and Venus, which are secrets to him, through the testimony of the moon, and he struggles with it because it's a tetragonal relation, a square. And again, there were other influences on Jung, stemming from his mother, the moon, and maternal grandfather Samuel Pricework, which was the father of his mother, a respected pastor in Basel, who had contact with a different world altogether, the spirit world. And his mother said, while your grandpa wrote his sermons, I had to stand behind him to keep the bad spirits away. Interesting. So, and Jung experienced his mother as a dark and unpredictable, rooted in deep invisible ground. Yeah, invisible, yeah, right, because the ruler of the moon is of course Venus, which is in the 6th place, a deep invisible ground. So Jung had to deal with a quite heady mix of Swiss Protestantism and pagan spirituality. And this is all attested to and testified to use the right word, by the moon and Jupiter, testifying about Venus and Mercury to Jung, Mr. Jung, being represented by Saturn in the 1st place. So my dear listeners, this is actually the treatment of things going on with the ruler of the 1st place, simply by one of the first things I tried to do, simply by checking out the configurations on the aspects within 3 portions with Saturn, the ruler of the 1st place. But then we're not done yet, because we need to address the essential dignities, so which have to do with rulers, exaltation, bound rulers, etc., having to do with Saturn. And then we come to sort of a new chart, which is from the software Planetdance, the Ed Greek module, the Ed Greek page, which is a very interesting one for traditional astrologers, simply because you can find a lot of material on it having to do with the way I treat of these topics, which are really excellent. Not the topics, but its pages, right? So yeah, but this is something for the next video on this topic. So I'm hoping to see you again there, and well, let's have a look at the other things having to do with the ruler of the 1st place in Jung's chart, which is of course the dignities having a relation with Saturn, the ruler of his 1st place, Mr. Jung himself and his life. So thanks everyone for watching and listening to this. Thanks everyone for the kind comments on this video, the previous one, the long one, and I hope you will enjoy this shorter version as well. And thanks for all the comments. Whenever you have questions, don't be afraid to ask them. I will try to answer them as good as I can with the knowledge that I have, which is very small in relation to whatever Mr. Schmidt was able to produce with his studies of this material, but I'm simply trying to work them and try to give an example of them. So I hope you like them, I hope you enjoy them, and I hope to see you next time in the next section on the Jung Talks. Thank you and bye bye.